Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. For those of you in the local area, at least I'm based in Nashville, we've got a game that I'm going to be covering tomorrow. In the meantime, we're going to be talking about the Titans' preseason opponent more on a larger scale with Greg today. I don't think there's going to be a lot of preseason scouting outside of individual players on this podcast, Greg, who may pop up in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, look, these games are very, very important to players, and particularly players who are lower round picks, free agents. This is their opportunity to get out there, that's really, really important. You're talking about guys' livelihoods. I mean, these guys, it's a dream that these kids have had ever since they started playing football. Not everybody's an All-American. Not everybody's a first-round pick. Probably most guys, were really good high school players. A lot of guys are recruited, but, as we know, as you get higher and higher, some guys just get weeded out a little bit and they still play. And, it's an opportunity. And that's the most important thing. It's really important to these players. That's the critical part.
Without question. And certainly for the rookies to at least get some live game reps in the absence of, what they may get over the course of training camp practice. But Baltimore, Greg, is always interesting. As long as Lamar Jackson is the quarterback, Baltimore will continue to be interesting. It's a hugely successful organization, both at identifying talent and finding how the talent fits their specific systems. They do so well in the compensatory draft that way with the picks that they're able to acquire, because they can still find talent even as they let really, really good players go to get paid by other teams. But looking at the conversation around Lamar, it's, Greg Roman is saying he's throwing the ball as well as he's ever seen him, and all kinds of training camp tropes that I think we associate with this time of year. But it does feel like Lamar will have a better chance, one, provided he stay healthy, and two, because they have a really interesting collection of players around him heading into the season.
Yeah, Lamar is actually a pretty good thrower. I mean, it's funny. This offseason, I've watched a lot of quarterbacks, and as we've discussed before, I have the opportunity in the offseason to watch in one day or a day and a half 250 or 300 dropbacks of a quarterback, which I don't get that same opportunity, Buck, during the season, because I'm working week to week, and I have to try
too many quarterbacks to watch.
Yeah, and I have to get through as many games as I can. I'm not only watching quarterbacks, obviously. So when you watch 250 or 300 dropbacks kind of consecutively, and like I said, I don't race through it, so it's not as if I have a deadline. I start at 7 a.m. and have to be done by 11. It's not like that, but you get a totally different feel when you watch a player. And, Lamar is not a bad thrower at all. He doesn't compare to, the high level throwers in the league. He certainly doesn't compare to the Matthew Staffords, the Josh Allens, the Justin Herberts. He doesn't compare to those guys, but he is not a bad thrower. He's an unconventional thrower.
Right.
He's not really a footwork balanced thrower with a firm base. His feet are almost always moving and unsettled, but yet he's very strong through his core and his torso, and that kind of allows him to make throws without stepping into them. So he gets his hips and his core through his throws without really being balanced on his feet. So that's unconventional, but he's probably thrown like that ever since he picked up a football, and that's the way he throws.
And it completely works for him. I mean, there are obvious places where you could stand to see improvement, as you could say, of any number of players in any number of areas. But for Lamar, what he does has been hugely successful for him. And the additional element of, I don't know that there's a better second reaction runner in football, Greg. He's just such an electric player.
Yeah, there isn't. He's the best second reaction runner in the league. And obviously he knows that he is, and therefore he will take off at times when you wouldn't coach it that way, because there might be a throw to be made, but he's so good with his second reaction running that he can gain meaningful yards, explosive yards at times. Other quarterbacks, you'd say, come on, you have to throw that ball. The design of the play worked. the receiver by NFL standards was open, you got to turn that loose. You would, in an ideal world, would you like Lamar to do that? Probably, but you're not going to get him on the sideline and say, come on, what are you doing? Because he's so good I mean, he's the best, as you said, Buck, and you're right. He's the best second reaction improvisational runner in the league, and he makes a lot of plays. Now, one point that I think is really worth making, and it's one reason I think Baltimore is really hard to defend, is because of Lamar and because of the foundational structure of their offense, they're different than any other team in the league. So imagine if you're, and this won't be the case in the preseason game, obviously, because it's a preseason game. But let's say you're playing the Ravens week 5, okay? And through the early part of your season, you've played Stafford, you've played Herbert, you've played Burrow, you've played Kirk Cousins. These are all pretty conventional NFL offenses with drop back passing games. And then all of a sudden you get the Ravens, and you don't have a lot of time to prepare. So now all of a sudden during the week, how do you go about preparing for playing an offense that's totally different in many respects than what you get pretty much all the time in the NFL? You can't change everything you do defensively in 2 or 3 days. That's not humanly possible. Now, right. You'll make a tweak here and there because you have to, but and I'm sure it's coach specific and team specific, but you can't change everything, Buck. It's too hard. You're putting too much of a mental burden on your players, and they won't be able to react physically in the manner in which they need to defend the offense. So you end up probably relying on the rules of your defense with a few tweaks and the ability of your players to see things. But that's one reason they're so difficult to play against, because they're different, and it's very, very hard.
Yeah, it's been in just having the opportunity to watch Lamar a couple of times play against the Titans. Like they see, there's always moments where you can disguise at the snap and kind of, as we talked about last week against Josh Allen, the zone exchanges that just make you think for an extra second about what you're seeing as the ball comes out that might delay the quarterback for a moment. But with so many different options that Baltimore has, and with the stable of running backs that they have, J.K. Dobbins expected to be available for the regular season, that's going to give them an extra element where they're not putting parts and pieces back together, because they were so hurt last year, Greg. And now with the variety of tight ends that they have as well, they can really play to Lamar's strengths and kind of maximize what it is they do. Because I didn't realize they had 5 or 6 fourth-round picks this year from the way that they work the draft process.
Let's see. I'm looking. I see 5. I think they had 5.
Yeah. And 2 of them tight ends that we talked about a great deal on this podcast pre-draft, guys that I think we both liked coming out of the draft process.
Yeah, Isaiah Likely and Charlie Kolar. But the other thing is formationally they're a little different too, because of the way they use their tight ends. Very often they line up with tight ends in the backfield, and you have to decide, hey, how do we treat that? A perfect example is, and this is different, but it just shows you that how teams treat things. Very often, if you see a wide receiver in the backfield offset, and he's the only player other than the quarterback in the backfield, defenses will treat that as an empty set because it's a wide receiver in the backfield, not a back. So teams have different ways they treat different formations, and the Ravens give you different formations because of the use of their tight ends. They could have a pistol formation, okay, where you have obviously Jackson, he's in the gun, but it's pistol because the back is behind him. Mm-hmm. But Jackson could be flanked by 2 tight ends.
Right.
So you have 2 tight ends in the backfield and a back behind Jackson. So you have to decide in your preparation, how do we treat that? Because it all comes down to rules. Everything is based on rules. No one says to players, just go out there. That's what people say in press conferences, because they're not getting into the, hardcore X's and O's of what they do. So they say, oh, you got to make plays. That's what people say, as I said, in press conferences and just when they're shooting the breeze.
Yeah. But it benefits them none to go into detail with people like us in a post-game press conference.
Of course. but that's not the way they coach it,
Right.
Buck. As you know, you've been around. No coach. Mike Vrabel. I guess they've had 13 or 14 practices now. No one's going out there and saying, you know what, we're going to do today. We're just going to run around and make plays.
That's
No
right.
one says that. No one coaches that way. So you have to decide. And I remember about 3 or 4 years ago having a great conversation at the combine. It was pre-pandemic with Dennis Allen, the Saints D coordinator, and I was asking him how
Now
he
head
deals.
coach.
Right now head coach. You're right, and I was asking him, how do you deal with different things? And he says, well, we have our rules, and at some point you have to play to your rules, and then the players have to react, because you can't give guys 50 rules
Right.
because then they can't play.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, what happens to some degree when you play Baltimore, particularly if you get them, mid-season. If they're your week one opponent, or week two, you certainly have more. Let's put it this way: if you play them in the first quarter of your season, I think you can do a lot of specific work leading up to playing them. But if you get them week 7 or 8 or 12, then you're kind of,
You're
I don't
you're
want to say
just
I don't want to say you're
reacting.
stuck, but you can do some tweaks, obviously, that are specific to what Baltimore does, but you can't change your entire defense.
Right. And that, I mean, that's something that Greg Roman has had so much time in the league over many, many years and several different teams at this point, kind of refining now with an athlete and player like Lamar at the quarterback position. It allows them to do so much more. I mean, Greg, I don't know how, because I remember what that 49ers offense was with Greg Roman under Jim Harbaugh and Colin Kaepernick, the amount of different players that they used to utilize Kaepernick's skill set. Lamar is obviously a different player. There's different traits that you associate with both of those. But you look at kind of the creativity that started there, at least the first time that I noticed it, in that Super Bowl run where they ended up ironically losing to the Ravens. And it's cool to see kind of the next evolution of that when you watch it on Sundays now with Lamar.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because that was back when the zone read and kind of was a bit new in the league,
Right.
and defenses weren't yet sure how to defend it. And now obviously teams have a better feel for it. Obviously it's part of the league, and there are teams that still do it. A lot of teams do it, but defenses have a much better feel for how to defend it right now. Back then, I mean, how many times did we see Colin Kaepernick in that season just clear the edge with no one there?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen quite as much now. But the one thing when you play a team like the Ravens is you do not want Lamar getting on the perimeter clean, because he's so fast and so explosive and very shifty. I mean, he's like a back, really, when he runs. He's not a quarterback running, he's a back. And you just don't want him getting out on the edge clean. So, but they're so good with their formations, with their blocking schemes. Some of them are a little different, and it makes it very, very difficult. And what that creates, by the way, and here's something I went through and looked at a ton of Mark Andrews as well. A lot of people might not be aware that he caught over 100 balls last year, and he had the second most first down targets in the league. He was targeted 69 times on first down. Only Stephon Diggs with 70 had more first down targets, and that makes perfect sense for this reason. You are really so conscious of defending Lamar in that run game on first down that you play a certain way, and it makes perfect sense that they could scheme Andrews based on what they are going to get from the defense, because the defense is so conscious of the run. So Andrews faced a ton of zone coverage because that's what teams played, and they were able to do such a good job scheming route concepts to get Andrews the ball. Andrews, when I looked at his work, he didn't face a ton of man coverage. Now, he did win against man. I'm not going to sit here and say he never won against man, and I think he's a very good player overall, but he caught a ton of passes against zone coverage.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, because I know we've talked about this a little in detail at some point in the last couple of months, but I feel like we talked about the idea that defenses played a lot of man against Lamar on third down last year against that Ravens offense.
They blitzed
a lot on third down last year. Not necessarily the conventional way that I think a lot of people would think about defending Lamar Jackson in those situations, because if you get a guy out of position, you got a guy in man coverage with his back to Lamar, and all of a sudden he takes off, it leaves them more vulnerable. But why? What did you see from Lamar in those situations that made that kind of explained why defenses were playing him that way?
Then it comes down to how you blitz. There's many ways to blitz, Buck. So, people automatically say, well, if you play you don't play man coverage against Lamar because defenders turn their backs. But defensive coordinators and defenses are so far more advanced now than just, don't play man. Because what teams do is they study to see how a quarterback moves when he gets pressured.
Right.
It's just like, and we talked about this briefly last week. We'll talk about it more leading up to week 2. When you play Josh Allen and the Bills, the last thing you want to do is allow him to escape to his right. He just makes too many plays to his right. We talked last week about in the game week 6 last year on Monday night, how he hit Beasley for a touchdown when they allowed him to escape to his right. Now, there was a breakdown in coverage. A mistake was made. But the point is, you do not want Josh Allen to escape to his right. So with Jackson, where you don't want him to do certain things. So you're not going to go into a game and say, well, we're never going to play man and we're never going to pressure him. You do that knowing what he's going to do. So the Ravens saw a lot of man coverage and a lot of pressure last year on third down. And Jackson was sacked versus blitz more than any quarterback, second other than Ryan Tannehill, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. He was sacked versus blitz more than any quarterback other than Tannehill. And his yards per attempt versus blitz was terrible. It was among the lowest in the league. So teams clearly felt, because Jackson, as great as he is as a runner, Buck, one thing he does have a tendency to do, when he either feels or perceives, and perceives is the key word, perceives pressure, he will drop his eyes and break down. And because he knows he can run. But you know what? You can't always do that in the NFL. He does it enough where he's truly special, but you can't do that, 25 times a game. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, and certainly did not happen for them last year. And again, Lamar dealing with injuries throughout the course of the season. So we'll see what a larger sample size looks like this year. Rashod Bateman is also somebody who we didn't see a full sample size of last year, Greg. But when we did see him on the field, and obviously the tape was great in college coming out of Minnesota, if I recall correctly, whatever concerns there might be about weaponry for the Ravens for people who are just participating in preseason and offseason chatter, things like that. Rashod Bateman, I know you regarded him very, very well coming out in a wide receiver class that has since then turned out to be quite talented.
Yeah, I really like Bateman. I watched him both after that junior year or sophomore year, whatever it was, when he was really good. And then I watched him again his last year when that was the COVID year. I think he only played 5 or 6 games, and it just didn't seem the same. I'm sure for a lot of players that was kind of a crazy year.
Right.
But the thing that really struck me about Bateman, Buck, was watching him on tape. I thought he was going to be like 205, and then at the combine, or maybe was that the year there was no, I can't remember. The point is he was 190 pounds, and I was blown away by that because on tape he looked bigger to me. Mm-hmm. But I like Bateman. I think he can get vertical. I think he catches the ball in the middle of the field really well. I think for fantasy people, this is probably the year they think Bateman's going to put up the big numbers. We'll see how it goes. I mean, there are other receivers, I guess, would be Duvernay at this point.
And James Prochet.
Who actually was a really fun player to watch coming out of college. I didn't think he'd be a high draft choice, but the guy's pretty refined. Mm-hmm. He might be an interesting player in this offense once the regular season starts. But Bateman, I think, is the guy everybody's counting on. He was a first-round pick, and he does have 3-level ability. So we'll see. But I think most would agree that their third down pass game and their drop back pass game, now where they can do all the backfield actions, but their drop back pass game is somewhat inconsistent. There are times Lamar has been phenomenal at it. People might remember the Monday night game against Indianapolis earlier this past season where they were down big and they had to drop back and throw it, and Lamar was phenomenal in that game. So he can do it. He's, like I said, he's, for those who don't like Lamar and act like he can't throw, they're wrong. Is he a high level thrower? No, but that's okay. He's great at other things, but he's not a bad thrower by any means.
No, I don't. Just the idea that
Yeah.
anybody could not like watching Lamar Jackson is such a foreign concept to me, and that offense. It's a lot of fun when it's clicking, and it's certainly
Yeah.
difficult for defenses.
And you know what, Buck? He may always be the guy, because this is one of the things that makes him great. He may always be a guy that drops his eyes and looks to run at times. That just may be built into who he is and his DNA at this point. That's because he can do it. And you know what? There'll be times it doesn't work, and there are games he gets sacked a lot. Very often, and we've seen this through the years, quarterbacks who are, I don't want to say who are mobile, but who leave the pocket prematurely,
Sure.
which Lamar does at times, those quarterbacks tend to get sacked more than pure pocket quarterbacks, because pure pocket quarterbacks, they've grown up their whole lives looking to get rid of the ball, so they know where to get rid of the ball. Lamar, he doesn't think immediately about getting rid of the ball. He thinks about the fact that I'm the best athlete on the field and I'm going to make a play.
Yeah. And it's crazy that, like you said, it's not going to work every time, but it's crazy that it works a fair amount of the time,
and we've discussed
given that
this
he is
before.
such a superior athlete.
And we discussed this before, but Tennessee remembers the playoff game a couple of years ago when it was 3rd and 9 from about midfield, and he ran 50 yards for a touchdown, or whatever the number of yards I know was about midfield, and that turned out to be the defining play in the game.
48 yards. I'll never forget. I've never seen a human being move that fast in person in my life, but it was a lot of fun to watch. Not for Titans fans.
He can do that on any given play. So that's the point I was trying to make about your defense. When you play Lamar, you in a sense, when it gets to be 3rd down, even though they weren't very good, even though teams did pressure them a lot, very often with Lamar, there's 2 defenses you play on 3rd down. There's the first 2 seconds, and then what happens after 2 seconds, and they could be 2 totally different things.
No question. Well, I'm not going to see him play tomorrow night or on Thursday night as we tape the podcast in Baltimore, but I'll certainly look forward to what the Ravens have in store for Lamar this season. Greg, I appreciate you taking the time as always. And next week, I know we'll have some specific players from the preseason to watch. A lot of conversation about Malik Willis, Treylon Burks, Kyle Phillips getting a lot of action at training camp so far with Ryan Tannehill.
Who's right now is the right tackle position between Radens and Petit Frere?
Yes. And in fact, Petit Frere getting first team reps recently, having earned them from the coaching staff.
Interesting. Well, he's as you've probably seen, he's very gifted physically. He had a lot of technique work to clean up, but that's what coaching is for. If that can be cleaned up and he can truly play to his athletic ability and his size, because he's a big kid,
huge.
He's got a lot of talent. I mean, it didn't always show up, and we discussed him obviously and the issues he had at Ohio State in his last year, and even in the year before, just because he had major technique issues. But a lot of O-line coaches feel that they can clean up technique issues.
And certainly he's been a very willing learner. Keith Carter, their offensive line coach, speaks glowingly about him. And that coaching staff doesn't speak glowingly about just about anybody.
and you probably know this because you're around, but I've read that he's a very smart kid.
Very bright. Really enjoyed several conversations that I've had with him so far. It's nice to be able to talk to these guys and be around them again. It gives you a better sense of who they are and how they learn and all variety of different things. Well, Greg, I'll look forward to next week, and we'll talk about some specific players then.
Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it.